There's a piece of silk sitting in a bank vault in England right now. It is 9 feet long, spattered with blood that dried over 137 years ago, and it may be the single most important piece of unsolved crime evidence in the history of the world. For over a century, the man behind history's most infamous murder spree walked free. He was never caught, never charged, never named in a courtroom. He killed 5 women in the span of 11 weeks, cut through the fog of Victorian London without leaving a single witness who could identify him with certainty, and then vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but mutilated bodies, taunting letters, and a mystery so deep it has outlasted every detective, every theory, and every generation that has tried to solve it, until now. Because DNA testing has finally pointed a finger at a name, a real name, a face, a man who lived, breathed, and walked those same dark streets in 1888. And the answer is not who most people expected. It is not an aristocrat. It is not a doctor with royal connections. It is not a famous painter or a prominent lawyer or any of the elaborate theories that have been built up over a century of speculation. It is something far more human, far more ordinary, and in some ways far more disturbing than any of that. This is the story of what science finally found. And it is a story that is still not finished. To understand what the DNA revealed and why it matters, you have to first understand the world that produced Jack the Ripper. The Whitechapel district of London's East End in 1888 was not just a poor neighborhood. It was a place where poverty had become so concentrated and so extreme that it had created its own ecosystem of desperation. The streets were overcrowded beyond what modern minds can easily picture. Entire families lived in single rooms with no heat and no running water. The air smelled permanently of coal smoke, garbage, and animal waste from the slaughterhouses that operated nearby. Thousands of people slept in lodging houses every night, paying a few pennies for a bed in a room packed with strangers, or sleeping in doorways and alleys if they could not afford even that. Women who had no other options sold themselves on the street for pennies, enough to pay for a bed or a meal in neighborhoods where the gas lamps barely cut through the darkness, and the police were stretched impossibly thin across miles of winding alleyways and shadow-filled courts. This was the world the killer chose, and the choice was deliberate. It was a world where a man could disappear into the darkness between one street lamp and the next, and nobody would think twice about a woman standing at a corner at 3 a.m, and a body could cool in a doorway for an hour before anyone found it. The Ripper did not just know this world, he understood it. He used it. The first murder came on August 31st, 1888. A woman named Mary Ann Nichols, known to everyone around her as Polly, was found in the early morning hours on Bucks Row in Whitechapel. Her throat had been cut twice, the blade driving so deep it nearly reached her spine. Her abdomen had been slashed open. The police surgeon who examined her said the injuries indicated a significant level of anatomical knowledge. The man who did this knew where the organs were and how to reach them quickly and quietly. The second murder came 8 days later. Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street on September 8th, her throat cut the same way, her body mutilated far more extensively. The killer had removed her uterus and taken it away with him into the night. This was not frenzied violence. This was methodical, practiced, deliberate work, carried out in darkness and in silence, quickly enough that no one in the surrounding houses heard a thing. London woke up to newspaper headlines that described the murders in language that had never been used in print before, and the city felt something shift. This was different. This was something new. Then came the night that the city would never forget. September 30th, 1888. 2 murders in a single night. Elizabeth Stride was found just after midnight on Berner Street, her throat cut, but her body otherwise untouched, as if the killer had been interrupted mid-act and had fled before he could finish what he started. 45 minutes later, less than a mile away in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes was found. And the scene that the police officers who arrived described was something that would stay with everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. Her face had been mutilated. Her ear had been partially cut away. Her nose had been sliced. Her cheeks had been carved with cuts that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. Her abdomen had been opened, her intestines drawn out and placed over her right shoulder, and the killer had removed her left kidney and her uterus and carried them away. The medical examiner estimated the entire mutilation had been carried out in 4 to 5 minutes. 4 to 5 minutes. In the dark, silently. This was a man who had done this before, or who had practiced with extraordinary dedication, or who had a level of anatomical knowledge that in 1888 was associated with medical training. The city descended into something close to panic. Hundreds of letters flooded into the central news agency and the police. Most were clearly from members of the public. One became the most famous letter in criminal history. It was signed for the first time with the name Jack the Ripper. The final confirmed murder came on November 9th, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the 5 women who would come to be known as the canonical victims. She was also the only one killed indoors, in her own rented room on Dorset Street. What the police found there when they finally broke through her door that morning was so extreme that a senior officer at the scene later wrote that it was the most horrifying thing he had ever witnessed in his career. The killer had had time and privacy for the first time, and the injuries reflected that. The investigation afterwards was essentially hopeless. Victorian forensics had no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis, no forensic photography in any systematic sense, no reliable methods for preserving or analyzing physical evidence from a crime scene. Scotland Yard was operating with tools that were almost laughably inadequate for the crime they were trying to solve. They had eyewitnesses who gave contradictory descriptions. They had letters, most of which were obvious hoaxes. They had suspects, dozens of them, none of whom could be charged because none of whom could be conclusively placed at any crime scene at the moment it mattered. And then the murders simply stopped. No more canonical killings after November 1888. The killer disappeared into the fog of Victorian London and never came back. The case went cold and stayed cold for over a century. Over the next 130 years, the number of suspects proposed by amateur and professional investigators reached into the hundreds. The theories ranged from the plausible to the genuinely absurd. Senior members of the British royal family were implicated. Famous painters were accused. Doctors, lawyers, and butchers all had their advocates in the Ripper research community. The problem was that every theory, no matter how elaborate and no matter how passionately argued, ultimately rested on circumstantial evidence. No one had ever found a piece of physical evidence that could definitively link a specific person to the murders. And without that, every theory was just a theory, and the truth stayed buried. Until a 9-foot silk shawl changed everything. The story of the shawl begins at a London auction in 2007. A businessman and amateur Ripper researcher named Russell Edwards spotted a silk shawl being sold as a piece of crime scene memorabilia, allegedly taken from the murder scene of Catherine Eddowes, the fourth canonical victim, on the night of September 30th, 1888. The story that came with the shawl was that a police sergeant named Amos Simpson had been at the scene that night, had noticed the shawl lying near Eddowes' body, and had taken it home rather than logging it as official evidence. His descendants had kept it for generations, passing it down through the family, until it eventually ended up at auction. Edwards bought it, and then he did something that nobody who had owned it before him had thought or been able to do. He sent it to a scientist. Dr. Jari Luhalinen was a molecular biologist and expert in historical DNA analysis at Liverpool John Moores University. He had the tools and the technical expertise to look at stains on a Victorian-era piece of cloth and try to find something that had survived 130 years of time, handling, and exposure. What he found, when he looked closely, was extraordinary. The shawl carried biological material. Bloodstains that infrared imaging showed were consistent with arterial splatter from a slashing wound to the neck. And separately, stains with characteristics consistent with semen. 2 types of biological evidence from 2 different people preserved inside the fibers of a piece of silk for over a century. Luhalinen extracted mitochondrial DNA from both sets of stains. Mitochondrial DNA is the genetic material that passes unchanged from mother to child, and it can survive in biological samples for extraordinary lengths of time under the right conditions. He then needed living descendants to compare against. For the blood, researchers tracked down a direct female line descendant of Catherine Eddowes. Karen Miller, Eddowes' great-great-great-granddaughter, provided a DNA sample. The comparison came back with a match. The blood on that shawl carried the same mitochondrial DNA signature as the woman whose body had been found in Mitre Square on September 30th, 1888. That in itself was staggering. After 130 years, they had placed a piece of fabric at the scene of one of history's most famous murders, but the second set of stains was where the real bombshell was waiting. The semen stains pointed toward the killer, and the DNA extracted from them matched a living relative of Aaron Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski. A name that some Ripper researchers had already had circled in their notes for decades, because Kosminski had been a serious suspect since the very beginning. He was 23 years old in 1888. He was a Polish Jewish immigrant who had arrived in England with his family in 1881, fleeing persecution in what was then the Russian Empire. He lived and worked as a barber in Whitechapel, right in the heart of the murder district, at the exact time the killings were happening. A senior Scotland Yard officer named Donald Swanson had written private notes in his personal copy of a colleague's memoirs describing a suspect he called Kosminski in terms that were unmistakable. He described him as a Polish Jew of low class with a deep hatred of women and homicidal tendencies, placed near one of the murder scenes by a witness, but never charged because the witness refused to give formal testimony against a fellow Jew. Swanson wrote that, after this, the suspect was identified and was shortly afterward safely caged in an asylum. Another senior officer, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson, wrote in his own memoirs that he was personally convinced the killer was a Polish Jew who had been institutionalized, and that the case was in his mind effectively solved, just never formally closed. Both men pointed their fingers at Kosminski without ever quite naming him publicly in a way that could carry legal weight. The clinical records that survived from Kosminski's time in the asylum paint a portrait of a man in severe psychological distress. He experienced constant auditory hallucinations, voices that would not stop. He had a paranoid fear of being given food by anyone else, which drove him to pick up and eat scraps he found on the ground, rather than accept anything handed to him. He refused to bathe. He refused to cooperate with basic medical requests. His weight at one point dropped to 99 pounds, a figure that reflects total physical as well as mental deterioration. He had threatened his own sister with a knife before being committed to the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in February 1891, roughly 2 years after the last canonical murder. He would spend the rest of his life institutionalized, moving eventually to the Leavesden Asylum, where he died in March 1919 at the age of 53 from gangrene. He died in an institution without ever being charged with the murders, without ever knowing that 100 years later his name would be synonymous with the most famous unsolved case in criminal history. The DNA match that Lou Halanen found connecting the semen stains on the shawl to a descendant of Kosminski's sister was published first in a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The researchers described the DNA match as producing a sequence that matched at a level they described as virtually certain to belong to someone from the same maternal line. In February 2025, Russell Edwards went public with updated findings, telling news programs, including a special broadcast on News Nation, that the DNA match was now at 100%. He declared that his search was over, that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, that the case was finally closed after 137 years. But here's where the story becomes something more complicated and more honest than a clean television resolution. Because the scientific community did not simply agree, and the reasons they pushed back tell us something important about what DNA evidence can and cannot actually prove. The first problem is the shawl's provenance. There is no police record from 1888 that documents a shawl being removed from the Eddowes crime scene, no inventory log, no contemporaneous mention. The entire chain of custody for that piece of fabric rests on a family story passed down through generations, beginning with a police sergeant who reportedly helped himself to a piece of evidence without logging it. The shawl has changed hands multiple times in the centuries since, has been photographed and handled and displayed without proper forensic precautions. People touched it with bare hands. Their DNA went onto it. The precise chain of contamination that shawl accumulated across 130 years is simply impossible to fully reconstruct or exclude. Genetics expert Adam Rutherford, who examined the claims publicly, noted that the way the shawl had been handled over the years would render standard forensic DNA analysis cripplingly problematic in any modern court. Dr. Turi King, the University of Leicester geneticist who led the DNA identification of Richard III, pointed out a specific technical issue that many media reports glossed over. The DNA analysis was performed on mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line only. A man cannot pass his mitochondrial DNA to descendants. He gets it from his mother, but it stops with him. So the DNA found on the shawl being matched to a relative of Kosminski's sister does not prove it came from Kosminski himself. It proves it came from someone in the same maternal line, which could theoretically include any number of people who shared that ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA of the type identified here, as other experts noted, may have been carried by thousands of people living in the same community in London in 1888. The match narrows the suspect pool. It does not, by the strict standards of forensic science, eliminate it to one person. None of this means Kosminski was not the Ripper. The scientific critics are not saying he was innocent. They are saying the DNA evidence, important and exciting as it is, does not yet meet the bar required to declare a case like this definitively closed. And that is a distinction worth taking seriously, because if the case is declared closed prematurely, based on evidence that cannot withstand full forensic scrutiny, then the real question gets buried again under a comfortable answer. And the real question is not just who did this. The real question is, how did he do it, in plain sight, repeatedly, without being caught? How does a 23-year-old barber with no apparent education beyond his trade, a man who would later be described by his own family as dangerously unstable and difficult to manage, carry out 5 of the most clinically precise murders in criminal history and then vanish without a trace? His own asylum records describe a man who could barely function, who ate food from the floor, who refused to wash, who was terrified of being fed by other people. Does that profile match a killer who worked with surgical efficiency in the dark alleyways of Whitechapel under the noses of an active police patrol? Some Ripper researchers say yes, that severe paranoid schizophrenia can coexist with extraordinary functional capability in specific areas, and that the disorganization visible in the asylum records reflects a man who had already been institutionalized and deteriorating for years by that point. Others say no, the profile does not fit. The DNA is not strong enough to close the book on alternatives. What everyone agrees on every side of this debate, is this. The Shawl DNA is the closest thing to physical forensic evidence from the Ripper case that has ever been produced. The Kosminski theory is not new, but it has never before had a biological component backing it up. The families of the victims, including descendants of Catherine Eddowes, who have gone on record in 2024 and 2025, demanding that the Metropolitan Police formally reopen the investigation and take the DNA findings seriously, deserve a real answer. They are not asking for a television special or a book deal. They are asking for what families of murder victims are owed, an official reckoning, a formal conclusion. And the Metropolitan Police have, as of early 2025, not knocked on the door. The Shawl sits in a bank vault. The DNA results sit in a published journal. And the case officially remains open, which means that by the formal standards of the institutions responsible for it, Jack the Ripper has still never been caught. What this case ultimately reveals is something bigger than one Victorian murder spree, as horrifying as those murders were. It reveals how long a mystery can resist resolution, even when the tools to solve it finally exist. The DNA is there. The living relatives are there. The published science is there. The historical records pointing to Kosminski as a serious suspect have been there for over a century. And yet, the gap between what science has found and what any institution will formally declare remains uncrossed. Because formally closing a case means formally accounting for how it was handled. It means admitting what was seen and not acted on in 1888. It means sitting with the fact that the women who were killed were poor, were marginalized, were deemed by the society around them to be expendable, and that the inadequacy of the investigation that followed their deaths was in part a reflection of how little their lives were valued by the institutions supposed to protect them. 5 women died in Whitechapel in 11 weeks in 1888. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were not just footnotes in a mystery. They were people with families, with histories, with the same claim on justice that any of us would want if it were our turn. The DNA on that shawl is not just evidence pointing at a suspect. It is the closest thing those women have ever had to an answer. And it is sitting in a bank vault waiting for someone with the authority to finally do something about it. The case is not closed, but for the first time in 137 years, the darkness that Jack the Ripper disappeared into has a name in it. Whether that name belongs on a charge sheet is the question that science has brought to the door of justice and that justice has still not answered.